After years of raising me as their own, my parents disowned me and cruelly cut me out of their will the moment they revealed I wasn't their biological child. But just when they thought I was left with nothing, I unexpectedly inherited a life-changing fortune from a distant relative they never even knew existed, and suddenly the tables turned in a way they never saw coming. My life underwent a profound transformation when I was 14. Around that period, my mother decided to enter a new relationship, this time with a man whose previous marriage had resulted in a son. Jake, already 3 years my senior, was 17. It's fair to say we didn't immediately connect. The ink on their marriage certificate had barely dried before tensions began to surface. Initially, it was the minor disagreements that emerge when unrelated individuals are suddenly designated as family and brought under one roof. Jake would often leave unwashed dishes in the sink, seemingly expecting them to clean themselves. Naturally, I was the one who received a stern lecture from my mother or new stepfather regarding the kitchen's state. Alternatively, I would notice my shampoo depleting more rapidly than usual, only to find Jake sporting impeccably styled hair, clearly achieved with my preferred product. It felt peculiar, but I was bothered by more than just Jake's antics. Tom, my stepfather, handled situations in a similar fashion. I appeared to be the scapegoat whenever something went amiss. He'd assume my culpability without even bothering to inquire. Then there was my mother. She was so preoccupied with making this new family dynamic function that she overlooked what was truly happening. She'd dismiss concerns, cover for Jake, and pretend everything was fine. I could instantly perceive the disparity in expectations. About a year into our challenging living arrangement, Mom and Tom announced they were expecting a child. At that moment, everything shifted. Suddenly, the entire household revolved around the impending arrival. The house required renovations, and guess which room was designated for the nursery? Precisely mine. I was relegated to a cramped, suffocating guest room with barely enough space for my belongings. It felt like a demotion, a clear indication of my subordinate position within this new family structure. A few months later, Nathan, my new half-brother, arrived and swiftly became the focal point of attention. Jake experienced a similar shift, becoming even more overbearing. He dropped out of college and returned home, bringing with him a torrent of late-night gatherings and dubious companions who came and went at all hours. Tom disregarded my complaints about the noise and mess, while my mother merely offered a sorrowful gaze as if to say, "What can we do?" It was infuriating. I began spending more time at friends' houses, anywhere I could find a sense of normalcy. My refuge ultimately became school. I remained there as long as possible, joining every club and enrolling in additional courses. This was more than mere adolescent rebellion, it was about survival. Home transformed into a place where I constantly felt as though I was walking on eggshells, anticipating the next conflict. It was stifling. One evening remains particularly vivid in my memory. I arrived home later than usual to find the house completely silent. A note on the refrigerator indicated they had gone out to dinner without me. I hadn't even been invited to this family meal. That note resonated more deeply than I had expected. I felt invisible, as if I truly didn't belong, and it stung. Everything nearly disintegrated shortly after my 18th birthday. I sensed Tom's disapproval of me having any reason to leave the house. Despite my part-time employment, he repeatedly asserted that it would jeopardize my academic progress. Then one evening I returned home to discover my room completely vandalized. Jake had hosted a party while my mother and Tom were absent, and my room bore the brunt of it. A broken lamp, alcohol stains on my project materials. It was a blatant invasion of my privacy. I confronted them at breakfast the following morning. Tom responded with cold disdain. "You should have been more careful with your possessions." My mother simply sighed and murmured something about families needing to unite and let go. I was done with letting things slide. Everything I did during those years seemed to be under scrutiny, not in a way that suggested concern for my well-being, but rather as if they were waiting for me to make an error so they could assign blame. Jake, who had evolved into a professional idler, seemed to escape any consequences. Although Nathan, my young half-brother, was still a child, the extensive pampering he received clearly indicated who the favorite was. I recall one instance when I was engrossed in a significant science project that I found genuinely captivating. Even at home, working on it was almost impossible. I craved quiet, so I set up a workstation in the corner of the living room. It felt like attempting to construct something delicate in the heart of a bustling city square. Eventually, I had had enough. Jake would blast loud music, Nathan would run around shouting, and Tom would complain about my project occupying too much space or creating a mess. After packing up, I went to a friend's house whose parents permitted me to work in their peaceful dining room. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was able to concentrate. That was when I grasped how peculiar my home life had become. My friend simply said, "You're always welcome here." The invitation was straightforward, yet it meant everything to me. For me, home was merely a place I longed to escape. A home is supposed to be a secure haven, yet every hour spent away from it allowed me to breathe a little easier. I began working additional shifts at my job. Of course, Tom disapproved. He frequently cited my employment as a distraction from my studies, but I understood his true reason. I wasn't around as much for him to criticize. As I accumulated more money, the idea of moving out began to solidify in my mind. However, I realized it wouldn't be simple. My mother and Tom were incapable of addressing the situation. The more I considered it, the more it seemed like the sole path to reclaiming control of my life. I was a bundle of nerves the day I decided to inform them of my departure. I had found a modest yet reasonably priced apartment near my campus. From my part-time work, I had saved enough to cover the first 3 months' rent. It wasn't a large sum, but it was mine. The prospect of having my own life and personal space kept me focused. One evening after dinner, I gathered Tom and Mom at the kitchen table. With my heart pounding, I tried to keep my voice steady. I looked them in the eyes and declared, "I'm moving out." The room fell silent, and I could feel the tension escalating. You could have heard a pin drop. Tom was the first to react. He smiled, shook his head, and said as if I had uttered the most absurd thing imaginable, "You think you're ready to live on your own just because of your age?" His voice was laced with astonishment and a hint of derision. At first, my mother said nothing. She simply sat there, gazing down at the table, her expression inscrutable. "I am ready," I asserted, attempting to sound more confident than I felt. The dispute began when I stated that I needed my own living space and had sufficient savings to cover it. Tom launched into a tirade, accusing me of being selfish, ungrateful, and attempting to shirk my domestic responsibilities. "He looks up to you, you know," he continued, trying to manipulate me into staying for Nathan's sake, as if that would be enough to keep me in a detrimental environment. My mother's reaction was calmer but no less disheartening. She didn't argue with me like Tom did, nor did she try to prevent me from leaving. She merely continued to lament, uttering phrases like, "Families stick together," and "You'll regret it if you leave." But I knew better. This was not about family, it was about control. I remained steadfast, not merely because I desired my own space, but because I absolutely needed it for my emotional and psychological well-being. I felt like an outsider in my supposed home. I was weary of being held accountable for matters beyond my influence, and of striving to fit into a family that had made it clear I wasn't truly a part of it. I spent the subsequent few days preparing. Every item I packed into a box felt like a step closer to autonomy. Even though it wasn't easy, my mother entered my room on the morning I was scheduled to depart. I braced myself for another confrontation, but it never materialized. Instead, she quietly helped me pack. Our conversation was brief. She inquired if I needed additional boxes or offered to donate old utensils. We both seemed to be sidestepping the real issues, making small talk to avoid acknowledging that this was the end of something. Later that day, when I locked the door to my new apartment, I experienced an unusual spectrum of emotions, including relief, sorrow, excitement, and apprehension. I was now living entirely independently. It felt simultaneously liberating and daunting. The initial few nights were the most challenging. The apartment seemed overwhelmingly vacant and quiet. I even found myself yearning for the unpleasant sounds of home, like Jake's loud music, Nathan running around, and Tom's incessant complaints. However, as the days turned into weeks, I grew to appreciate the tranquility. For the first time in years, I could truly breathe. I no longer had to navigate the house cautiously, worrying about Tom's mood swings or whether Jake had hosted another party. I could come and go as I pleased, eat when I wanted, and sleep undisturbed. It felt as though I was finally discovering who I was beyond the chaos of my family. A new kind of freedom. Life quickly found its rhythm. I balanced work, my studies, and maintaining my modest apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. My relationship with my mother and Tom improved slightly after I moved out of their residence. I maintained my distance but saw them occasionally, which made interactions easier. Then, unexpectedly, I received a call from my mother. Her voice was subdued and more hushed than usual. "Tom's been thinking about his will," she added simply, as if discussing the weather. "He wants to ensure everything is in order." I responded tentatively, unsure where this conversation was headed. After a pause, she said, "He has decided to include Jake and Nathan, but not you because they are his biological children. He believes it is more logical." There it was. Stung. Although I hadn't expected much from Tom, hearing it stated so bluntly wounded me more deeply than I had anticipated. It wasn't about the money but about the message, The stark reminder that despite all these years, I was still not considered a true member of the family. I compelled myself to answer neutrally, "I understand, Mom." Perhaps sensing the hurt, she hastily attempted to soften the blow. "You understand this is just legal matters. It doesn't affect our feelings for you, right?" Even if I didn't believe her, I allowed the conversation to shift to other topics, but the damage was already done. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, with that familiar sensation of not belonging gnawing at me. Part of me wanted to confront Tom, demand an explanation, or simply express how profoundly it hurt. However, another part of me questioned the purpose. For years, that family hadn't felt like a part of me, so why should it matter now? Ultimately, I chose to withdraw. I reduced my visits, kept busy with school and work, and dedicated more time to nurturing relationships with individuals who genuinely valued me. Friends, instructors, and colleagues who cherished me for who I was, not for what I could offer, or because we had once shared a home. These were the people who truly mattered. The pain from Tom's will and years of feeling like an outsider began to diminish. It wasn't an instantaneous transformation, but the resentment subsided, though it would occasionally resurface, especially at family gatherings when I saw Jake and Nathan basking in the spotlight. I started to realize that some things were beyond my influence. I began cultivating my own sense of belonging and community. A few months later, Tom recovered from his health scare, and their lives returned to normal. Then came the real test. I was invited to a family dinner to celebrate Tom's recovery. I attended out of obligation rather than desire. The evening was just as uncomfortable as I had anticipated. Tom spoke about his recuperation, everyone raved about Nathan's latest academic achievements, and Jake boasted about a new job he had suddenly acquired. I sat there relatively quiet, and it was painfully evident that I was the anomaly. However, this time it stung less. I had come to terms with my position within the family. I was the outsider, yet there were individuals in my life who cared for me for my own sake, not because of family duty or shared DNA. I made an excuse about an early start and departed after dinner. As I drove home, I felt a burden lift from my shoulders. "I'm good," I told myself, "really good." I had confronted the emotional impact, faced the reality of my situation, and emerged stronger and more self-assured than ever before. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. But life had another surprise in store. Just when I thought I had finally achieved some calm and routine, everything was upended once more. One afternoon, I received a call from a lawyer I had never heard of. His tone was polite and professional, but his voice carried an almost apologetic quality. "Am I speaking with Jessica Evans?" he inquired. "Yes, that's me," I replied, bewildered. "I'm calling about Margaret Evans, your great-aunt's estate," he explained, his tone slow and deliberate. "She passed away recently and named you as the sole beneficiary." For a brief moment I fell silent. I couldn't recall Aunt Margaret. She was one of those distant relatives you'd hear about but never truly knew. She didn't have any children, and I vaguely remembered my father mentioning her once or twice as someone who had helped raise him. I hadn't seen her in years, possibly since I was a small child, and now I was being informed she had left everything to me. "I'm sorry for your loss," the lawyer said, breaking the silence. "She was a remarkable woman." Still processing his remarks, I blurted out a thank you. Then, half expecting it to be something modest, perhaps an old house or a few family heirlooms, I inquired, "Exactly what did she leave behind?" "Your great-aunt was quite affluent," he stated. "Over the years, she made some excellent investments. The estate includes various properties, a substantial stock portfolio, and a trust fund worth approximately $3 million. My heart momentarily stopped. I sat there clutching my phone, wondering, why me? We weren't very close when I was younger. I had visited her a few times, but our relationship was never genuinely strong. My mind couldn't fully comprehend it. The attorney then mentioned, "She left a letter for you. I will forward it along with the other documents." He noted that she elaborated further on her decision. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, attempting to make sense of everything. Why did Aunt Margaret choose me to inherit everything? I barely knew her. Was this some kind of mistake? The next few days were spent meeting with the attorney, signing paperwork, and discovering precisely what I had inherited. There were houses, stocks, and personal effects in addition to the money. Aunt Margaret's letter, however, affected me profoundly. In it, she stated that she had always admired my independence and saw in me a reflection of herself at my age. She described me as resolute, self-sufficient, and capable of forging a life on my own, qualities she believed she lacked when she was younger. She wanted to offer me the chance to utilize her wealth for something meaningful. It was overwhelming. Here was this relative I barely knew, who saw something in me that my own family had failed to recognize. She appreciated and selected me. My initial step was to purchase a small home. Though not extravagant, it was mine and symbolized a new chapter in my life. Considering long-term financial security, I also acquired a rental property and invested the remaining funds. I consulted with a financial expert to ensure I made sound decisions. It felt surreal. In the span of a week, my life had completely transformed. I no longer had to struggle or worry about how I would make ends meet. For the first time, I felt truly secure and liberated. However, freedom brought a new set of challenges. Initially, I didn't inform anyone about the inheritance, not even my relatives. Given our turbulent past, I knew the news would not be well received. I owed them nothing, but secrets have a way of surfacing, and mine was no exception. It began with a cousin I hadn't seen in years, who learned about the bequest through legal channels. My mother found out before I did, and the rest of the family soon followed suit. The phone calls started almost immediately. First, my mother called in an unusually cheerful and inquisitive tone. She complimented me, then casually mentioned how financially challenging things had been for her and Tom. I sensed where the conversation was heading, and sure enough, the floodgates opened. Tom called first, then Jake, and then some distant cousins I hadn't heard from in years. Each implied in their own way that they needed a portion of my inheritance. Times are tough, they would say. My mother even commented, "You know how bad Tom's health has been," as if this explained their newfound interest in me. They all seemed to have forgotten about me, except as a potential source of funds. I was inundated with requests for money, loans, and gifts. It felt like vultures were circling, waiting for their opportunity to descend. I felt overwhelmed. For a brief period, I considered giving up, questioning whether retaining the inheritance was selfish. But then I recalled all the years I'd spent feeling like an outsider in my own family, being blamed, disregarded, and ignored. I had worked diligently to earn whatever I possessed before this windfall. I had navigated college independently without their assistance, and now that I had some stability, they wanted to take it away. When I was struggling, none of them offered help. When my mother eventually inquired why I hadn't told her about the bequest sooner, I found the resolve to reject the guilt and manipulation. I gently but firmly explained to her that our separation was both emotional and physical. I had been kept distant, overlooked, and alienated for years, as if I had no place in the family. This inheritance allowed me to live autonomously, without relying on anyone else. It is my life, I assured her, and I must live it in my own way. I apologize if this offends you, but right now I need to act in my best interests. The outcome of that conversation was worse than I could have anticipated. Mom accused me of being arrogant and inconsiderate. Tom interjected, chastising me about how family members should treat one another. Nevertheless, I stood my ground. Over time, the calls became less frequent, and the demands for money ceased when they understood I would not yield. It was challenging but absolutely essential. I had come to a somber realization about family. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who bring you down. Knowing that I had protected myself brought me peace. Finally, I decided not to let them dictate my life. This inheritance was about seizing control of my own destiny and, more importantly, gaining the ability to live my life on my own terms. My communication with them became strained, but I had grown accustomed to it. Their approval was no longer necessary, and I was not obligated to offer them anything. I had friends, mentors, and people who genuinely cared about me, not because of familial obligations but because of who I was. The biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. My younger half-brother, Nathan. I unexpectedly received a clumsy, handwritten note from him. "I'm sorry for asking for money. I miss you," he wrote in his untidy script. Though small, this gesture meant a great deal to me. Nathan, barely 14, was reaching out in his own way. After that, we began exchanging brief texts, short conversations about his school and interests, nothing too serious, but it was a start. It was the beginning of a modest connection between us. Even though I wasn't optimistic about reconciling with the rest of the family, I was building a life for myself, free from dependence on anyone else. For the first time in years, I felt completely liberated. However, the sense of tranquility was fleeting. Just as I thought things had settled down, my mother contacted me again a few weeks after Nathan's letter. This time she wished to discuss matters. I could tell this wasn't going to be a conversation about reconnecting or finding common ground, so I agreed to meet her in public, hoping to keep things civil. We met at a nearby cafe, and the atmosphere was unsettling from the outset. She rarely inquired about my life or how I was doing. Instead, she immediately launched into how financially difficult things had been since Tom's health crisis, and how Nathan's private school fees were accumulating. I sat there listening, feeling like an outsider to her litany of woes. It quickly became apparent why she had requested the meeting. She also added that they were considering upgrading the house, and that she desperately needed a vacation to alleviate her stress. It was clear she wasn't there to mend our relationship. She was there for a single purpose. Finally, I could not tolerate it any longer. I cut through the tension, saying, "Mom, just get to the point." She looked me directly in the eye and stated without hesitation, "I expect you to write me a check for $1 million. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me?" I asked incredulously. She did not waver. "It is only fair. Technically, since it came from your father's side of the family, all of that money should have been mine." I was stunned. Her sense of entitlement and audacity were astonishing. She sat there casually demanding $1 million as if it were her birthright. "I'm not giving you $1 million," I said bluntly, trying to keep my voice steady. Her tone shifted from entitled to outright anger, and her expression became severe. "You have always been unappreciative of everything we've done for you," she declared. Her remarks painted me as a criminal for not handing over money she claimed was owed to her. Without looking back, I paid for my coffee and left the cafe. It still astounds me that my own mother attempted to guilt me into giving her money to which she had no right. What followed was even worse. A few days later, my mother began spreading rumors. She informed everyone who would listen that I had stolen the inheritance, asserting it was rightfully hers, and accused me of hoarding it out of greed. Suddenly, relatives I hadn't heard from in years began calling, either to support her or to pressure me into sharing the money. The hypocrisy was staggering, especially given that Tom had excluded me from his own will because I wasn't family. Even Tom got involved, sending me a lengthy, guilt-laden text about how I needed to consider the family and make more inclusive decisions. I responded with a single sentence. "You didn't include me in your will because I'm not family, remember that?" That silenced him for a while, but the drama did not end there. Things escalated when I received an official-looking letter in the mail. To my astonishment, my mother was suing me. Yes, you read that correctly. She was suing me for a share of the inheritance, claiming that as my father's widow, she was entitled to a large portion of the money. I was stunned. Was my own mother dragging me to court? I could not believe it. At first, I was afraid, anticipating a prolonged and costly legal battle. I called my attorney, who laughed after reading the letter. "This is a joke," he remarked, tossing the letter aside. "The will is airtight." He then investigated the so-called attorney who had sent the letter. The phone number was disconnected, and the address on the letterhead was for a dilapidated building under construction. It became evident that my mother and Tom had engaged a dubious, most certainly fraudulent lawyer in a last-ditch attempt to intimidate me into paying them money. While I was relieved that the lawsuit was baseless, I was also terribly disappointed. Their willingness to go to such lengths for my inheritance was shocking. They had tried guilt-tripping and manipulating me, and now they were making direct legal threats. I was done attempting to salvage any kind of relationship with them. I understood I needed some distance. After the legal jitters subsided, the emotional toll hit me hard. I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and the constant drama was affecting my mental well-being. That was when I realized I needed a break from everything. We decided to take a road trip after discussing it with some friends. Nothing extravagant, just a journey to a couple of places we'd always wanted to visit, but never had the chance. It was precisely what I needed. Time to clear my head, escape the chaos, and most importantly, contemplate what I desired for my future. As we began our journey, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short period. A year ago, I was barely surviving in a house that never truly felt like home. I now possess financial security, my own residence, and the liberty to make my own decisions without interference from others. It felt liberating, yet also bittersweet. Growing up, I looked to my mother and stepfather for guidance and encouragement. To me, family meant having someone who would always support you no matter what. But through it all, I learned a harsh lesson. Just because someone is related by blood does not guarantee they will be there for you in the ways that truly matter. Throughout the trip, I reflected extensively and realized that I didn't need their money, validation, or acceptance. I had everything I required, and the relationships I genuinely valued were those I had cultivated with people who loved me for who I was, not for what I could offer them. In subtle ways, my friends, colleagues, and even Nathan expressed more authentic care for me than my mother or Tom ever did. Following the trip, I decided to compose letters to each family member who had attempted to influence me. I did it for myself, not for others. It was my way of achieving closure, articulating what I couldn't express in the heat of the moment. In those letters, I detailed how their actions had harmed me, and how, despite my desire to be a part of the family, I was consistently pushed aside. I wished them well and hoped they would move on just as I had. The only response I received came from Nathan. His letter was modest but heartfelt. I appreciate you delivering the letter. I miss you. Let's get together sometime. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Nathan and I might one day develop something genuine, free of obligation or manipulation. As for the rest of the family, I had finally accepted that we were better off maintaining a distance. The inheritance had served as a profound wake-up call. Not merely a financial blessing but also a revelation about my true family. It wasn't the people who raised me. It was those who supported me when I had nothing to offer but myself. Looking back, I have no regrets. I remained steadfast, safeguarded my future, and found peace by releasing the toxic connections that had been holding me back. Life has a peculiar way of teaching us what is truly essential, and I am grateful for that, no matter how difficult the lessons were. Sitting in my own home, surrounded by people who feel more like family than my actual relatives ever did, I know I am precisely where I should be.